Have you ever misremembered something important? So in the book of Exodus, there's a man named Moses, and he is tasked with leading the people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt. They've been in slavery for 400 years. So there's not a man, woman, or child alive who remembers what life is like outside of slavery in Egypt. And so they can't even imagine a life outside of slavery. But through Moses, God does some incredible miracles. He sends all these plagues at the Egyptians, and finally Pharaoh allows the Israelites to leave. So they pack up and take off, heading out into the wilderness. But then Pharaoh has a change of heart. So he sends his army out to capture or kill the escaping Israelites. So Moses, leading the people of Israel, finds himself between a rock and a hard place. He has the armies of Egypt behind him and the Red Sea in front of him, and people start complaining because they feel like there's no way out. But then Moses says, God's not going to let us perish. He's going to provide a way. And God instructs Moses to raise his hand over the waters, and the waters of the Red Sea part, and there's dry land, and they all begin to walk across. The people of Israel make it all the way across. The last man comes out of where the waters were. The army of Israel, or of Egypt, is following them. The waters come back in and drown out the army, and they are free and clear. Well, the people are so filled with awe and overjoyed at what has just taken place. I mean, they witnessed a miracle, an incredible miracle. They're so overtaken, they compose a song that they begin singing the praises of the God who delivered them from Egypt. Then a few days pass. They're in the wilderness, and they're struggling to find water, and they're getting thirsty. They come across an oasis, and they go and they approach the water, but they recognize that the water, they call it bitter. It's not good for drinking. And so they begin to complain, and they say, are we just supposed to die of thirst out here? And so God instructs Moses to take a piece of wood, and he tosses it into the water, and immediately the water is cleansed, and the people are able to drink the water. So more time passes. They're about a month removed from their escape from Egypt, and the people once again begin complaining. This is what they say in Exodus chapter 16, verse 3. If only the Lord had killed us back in Egypt, they moaned. There, we sat around with pots filled with meat and ate all the bread we wanted. But now you've brought us into this wilderness to starve us all to death. And I read this passage and I go, what? That doesn't make any sense. Like, don't they remember? They're a month out. Have they legitimately already forgotten that they were slaves in Egypt? Like, has that already somehow left their mind? Like, they were only given enough food to barely survive. They were given the bare minimum, and often even not that. People died in Egypt because of a lack of food. They were forced into hard labor, building homes they would never live in, harvesting food that they would never eat, building palaces for the very people who were oppressing them. And those are the good old days? That's what you want to get back to? Where are these pots filled with meat coming from? Because I have to think that they have manufactured these memories. It would seem to me that this entire group of people was having some memory issues. Like the whole group was suffering from a collective delusion as they misremembered the past, leading me back to my question. Have you ever misremembered something important? Like they had. In the modern era, we actually have a term for this. We have a term for when a large group of people remember something that never happened or that doesn't actually exist or misremember something significant. The term for it is the Mandela effect. Has anyone ever heard of the Mandela effect? So the Mandela effect gets its name from Nelson Mandela, an incredibly influential figure who was imprisoned for a number of years in apartheid in South Africa, but became the first president of South Africa in the late 90s and was kind of an influential international figure advocating for peace. However, there is a group of people who are convinced that they remember news reports saying that he had died in prison in the 80s. They're convinced that they're like, I remember a newspaper clipping or something on the TV saying that he definitely died in the 80s, despite the fact that he didn't die in the 80s. And so now there are a bunch of examples floating around on the internet of this Mandela effect. Let's see if you've fallen prey to any. Okay, so I've got a few pictures here. If you're watching online, I apologize. They're all trademarked, so I can't show you any of them. So here's the first one. This is the Monopoly guy. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. I'm not asking you if he had a monocle or didn't have a monocle. I'm asking you, what do you remember? Do you remember the Monopoly man with a monocle, or do you remember him without? Who remembers him with a monocle? Who remembers him without a monocle? Okay, so he doesn't have a monocle. That monocle never existed, right? But I definitely remember him with a monocle, right? Here's another one. Curious George. Does Curious George have a tail or not? Again, I'm not asking the question, does he or doesn't he have a tail? I'm asking you, what do you remember? Because chances are you probably haven't picked up one of these books in a minute. How many of you remember, I'm pretty sure I remember him having a tail. How many of you are like, I'm pretty sure I don't remember him having a tail? How many are like, I've never read one of those? I don't know. Okay, so no tail, which makes me think the artist has never seen a real monkey, but that's neither here nor there. Okay, here's another one. I got two more for us. Looney Tunes. Do you remember Looney Tunes as in cartoons or Looney Tunes as in music? How many of you remember it the first way, cartoons? How many of you remember it the second way? Okay, it's the second one. Yeah. And the reason is a lot of the old, like the really old ones, they it'd be like 20 minutes of stuff and there'd be a song somewhere in the middle. And that's often, but that's, see, we've misremembered it. And then I've got one more for us. Fruit of the Loom. Which one of these logos do you remember? Now, if you're currently wearing Fruit of the Loom underwear, you're not allowed to take off your pants and check. A, that's cheating, and B, it's wildly inappropriate in a public setting. So, how many of you remember a cornucopia in the Fruit of the Loom logo? How many of you remember, you're like, I'm pretty sure there's not, I don't remember. So there is no cornucopia in the Fruit of the Loom logo. So it would seem to me that some of us, even in this room, are suffering from some memory issues. It seems to me that we are misremembering some things as well. And so my goal this morning is to draw our attention to the fact that often we forget things, that often we misremember things, but then to give us a tool that can help us remember specifically what God has done in our lives. So we're wrapping up our series, Best Year Ever, and the goal of the series is simple. Over these 4 weeks, we've been starting a conversation about some practices and topics that I think can have a huge impact on our lives. So if we want 2023 to be a better year than 2022, we need to take note of and put into practice some of the things that God is sharing with us over the course of this month. And today I want to talk about memory. I want to talk about memory because if we're going to have the best year ever in 2023, we need to recognize our own tendency to forget. Specifically, our tendency to forget what God has done in our lives. So there's a fascinating study done on memory, actually a number of studies done on memory in the aftermath of 9/11. 9/11 was a big day. It was an important day. It's probably a day that as you think back, if you were around back then, like as you think back, it's probably a day you have memories of. You can remember where you were or what you were doing or how you felt that day. So there are these cultural moments that kind of tend to solidify in our memories and appear stronger than other memories. Social scientists call these flashbulb memories. They're often something big, emotional, maybe even traumatic that aids in our ability to remember the events of a certain, remember a certain event or maybe even a specific day. So knowing that 9/11 was going to be one of these flashbulb memory moments, a couple of researchers in the days following the attack went around and interviewed over 3,000 people specifically in New York City, but also around the world, asking for detailed descriptions of where they were, what they were doing, and how they felt that day. They had a set number of questions. I think it was 11 questions that they asked them, and they took detailed notes on the responses of every single one of the participants. Then they went back 1 year, 3 years, and 10 years later to ask the same set of questions to see how well, in one of these flashbulb moments, how well do people retain the memories? Here's what they learned. After 1 year, people could remember about 63% of the details from that day accurately. After 3 years, that number dropped to 57%, and after 10 years, that number dropped to 40%. However, here's what's interesting. Each person was asked to rate their confidence in their memory. So on a scale from 1 to 5, 1 being I'm not very confident, 5 being I am exceedingly confident that what I just gave you is correct, they asked people to rate themselves on how confident they were in their answers. And overwhelmingly, the average was above 4. So people were exceedingly confident that what they gave was the right answer, despite the fact that by 3 years in, they could barely remember half of the details correctly. Which to me says we have a bit of a memory problem, right? That our confidence is high, that what we are recalling, what we are sharing is accurate, but the research would say maybe not so accurate. By the way, it's not just science telling us that we have a memory problem. Scripture tells us the same thing. Time and time again, God implores his people to remember. He instructs them to never forget. Let me give you a few examples. This is Exodus 13:3. Moses said to the people, "This is a day to remember forever. The day you left Egypt, the place of your slavery. Today the Lord has brought you out by the power of his mighty hand." Deuteronomy 7:18. "But don't be afraid of them. Just remember what the Lord your God did to Pharaoh and to all the land of Egypt." Just remember. Just remember. Joshua 1:3. Joshua is instructing the people of Israel after Moses has passed, and he says, "Remember what Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you. The Lord your God is giving you a place of rest. He has given you this land." See, I think God in Scripture, he's constantly telling us to remember because we see this consistent pattern play out time and time again in the Old Testament. We even see this sometimes in the New Testament where God does a major work. That's how it starts. God does something incredible. God does a miracle. God delivers his people. Something incredible happens. And then people respond with worship and with repentance, and they're turning away from their sins, and they're destroying their idols, and they're turning back toward God, and they're observing holidays that they had forgotten, and they're returning back. They're turning back to God, but then the people of Israel begin to forget. And they go back to their old sins, and they go back to worshiping the idols, and they fall back into sinful habits, and they turn away from God. They fail to trust in him. Have you ever seen that same pattern play out in your life? where God does something incredible and you respond with, oh my goodness, God, you're amazing. Thank you for doing this. But then over time, you forget. As I thought about this, my mind was drawn back to a couple transitions I've had between churches where I was serving. First, I was a part-time children's pastor at a church in Fort Wayne, Indiana called Level 13 Church. I served there for a couple of years. Again, like I said, I was part-time. I enjoyed a lot of the job. I enjoyed many of the people I got to serve and the people I got to work with, but I knew it was time to start looking for something full-time. I knew that God was calling me out of part-time ministry into full-time ministry. And so as I was wrestling with these things, I had even brought them up to my lead pastor a little bit, and he kind of affirmed what I was wrestling with. But the good news was I had lots of time. There was no rush. I had plenty of time to look and to apply and to find the right fit. But then I found out that my lead pastor was leaving. And in the Wesleyan Church, there's this weird cultural quirk, where when a lead pastor leaves, it is tradition for all the staff pastors to turn in their letter of resignation, and the new pastor has the option to hire them back on or to not. And so knowing that was coming down the line, I got very anxious, I got very nervous, and I started applying like crazy. But then I happened upon a resume that I read it, and I was like, that sounds a lot like me. Or not a resume, a job posting. And I read it, and I was like, that sounds a lot like me. And I gave it to Chelsea, and she read it, and she's like, that sounds a lot like you. And I gave it to my lead pastor, and he read it, and he's like, you have to apply to this job. And long story short, we moved to Iowa before my lead pastor left his position. That's how quickly God moved. Like I got nervous because he was about to depart, but then I found that job, and then I left for Iowa, and then he left. Like, that's how fast God moved, and God provided the next position. Well, fast forward 3.5 years, and I am let go from my job at that church in Iowa. And here's what was interesting. As that was happening, I found it difficult to remember the time that God provided. I found it difficult to remember, hey, there was that time where your future was uncertain then too, where a timetable that you would imagine was sometime in the future got moved up to now, and God provided then. But I found it difficult to remember that. And so I found it difficult to trust God with that provision, because I was having a hard time remembering that time that he had provided. And so what if there's a different way? What if there's something that can aid us in remembering what God has done in the past so that we can trust him more fully in the present? Well, in Joshua chapter 3, by the way, we're going to be in Joshua chapter 4, verses 1 through 7. If you want to turn there, I'd invite you to do so. The text will be on the screen in just a minute. You've got a few minutes to turn there if you want to, because I got to set us up with what's going on before. So in Joshua chapter 3, this is after the people of Israel have left Egypt and they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and Moses has passed away, and Joshua has taken over leadership, and they're getting ready to enter into the promised land. This is the land that God had promised Abraham literally hundreds of years before, that as Abraham was wandering, God stopped him and said, Abraham, this land right here someday is going to belong to you and to your descendants. I'm going to give it to them. It's going to be a good land, a land of plenty, a land overflowing with milk and honey, a place where they can worship me in peace and prosperity. I'm going to give you this land. Well, now it's time to enter into that land that God has promised, but there was an obstacle. The Jordan River was between them and the promised land. And this would be an opportune time for nations who were afraid of the nation of Israel to come and attack them as they were trying to get soldiers, yes, but women and children across the river. This is a big river, and this was going to be a difficult crossing. So God does a miracle in their midst. Joshua instructs the priests to cleanse themselves and purify themselves, and they pick up the Ark of the Covenant, which was God's kind of physical presence among his people Israel, and they begin to walk down into the waters of the Jordan River, and as their feet begin touching where the water should be, the water begins bunching upriver from them and drying downriver, leaving nothing but open, dry land for them to walk across. Does that sound a little familiar? This is the same kind of thing that had happened 40 years prior. But if they weren't careful, they'd fall into old habits. Because 40 years ago, do you remember how long it took them to forget the miracle of God walking them through on dry land, the Red Sea? It took them a month for them to start going, if only we could be slaves again in Egypt. So Joshua and God telling Joshua, they want to give the people of Israel something to remember this moment, to remember that God stopped the waters of the Jordan River so that they could cross on dry land. And so here's what God tells them to do. This is verse 1 of chapter 4. When all the people had crossed the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Now choose 12 men, one from each tribe. Tell them, take 12 stones from the very place where the priests are standing in the middle of the Jordan. Carry them out and pile them up at the place where you will camp tonight." So Joshua called together the 12 men he had chosen, one from each of the tribes of Israel. He told them, "Go into the middle of the Jordan in front of the ark of the Lord your God. Each of you must pick up one stone, carry it on your shoulder." So there must have been pretty big stones. "Carry it on your shoulder, 12 stones in all, one for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. We will use these stones to build a memorial. In the future, your children will ask you, 'What do these stones mean?' Then you can tell them. They remind us that the Jordan River stopped flowing when the Ark of the Lord's covenant went across. These stones will stand as a memorial among the people of Israel forever." So God is telling the people of Israel, it's like, I don't want you to forget, as they often do. He wants them to remember his goodness and his provision and his faithfulness, because after all, this is a big moment. After waiting in this promise for hundreds of years, Abraham's descendants are finally going to get to go into the promised land. And so God does this miracle where he allows them, an event that could have taken upwards of weeks or even a month for them to get everyone across the river, because there were no bridges, to get everyone across, it happens in a matter of hours. It's an incredible miracle that's just happened in their midst, and so God instructs them to set up a memorial to remind them and to remind future generations of God's goodness and his faithfulness toward them. By the way, this isn't the only time that the people of God set up a memorial. There are other times before this happens. In Genesis chapter 28, Jacob, who is the grandson of Abraham, is out, and he's kind of on the run, and he lays down with his head on a rock, and he has this dream of angels going up and down a staircase that extends from earth to heaven, and he sees this, and he wakes up, and he's so in awe of the dream that he just had, he declares the ground holy, and he takes the rock that he was using as a pillow, and he sets it up as a monument, and he calls the place Bethel. And then he goes and he gets a family, and when he's bringing his family back to his ancestral home, they stop at that place so that Jacob can tell them the story. This is the time that God showed up. This is the time that I was on the run, and I thought my life was ended, but I met God here, and he delivered me. Then generations down the road in 1 Samuel 7, Samuel at this point is the spiritual leader of Israel, and they're in a conflict with the Philistines who are invading their land and causing a whole bunch of problems, and it's looking like Israel's going to be overwhelmed by their military, but God throws their armies into confusion, and they're able to defeat their enemies and drive them out of the land. And to remember this, against the odds, miraculous victory in battle, Samuel sets up a stone as a reminder. He names the stone Ebenezer, which means stone of help. This is, by the way, if you know the old hymn, Come Thou Fount, there's a phrase in there, here I raise my Ebenezer. That's where we get that phrase from. It's the stone that they raised up to help remember of when God did a miracle in their midst, when they had an experience or an encounter with the living God. So the practice of using stones as a reminder of God's faithfulness happens multiple times throughout Scripture. These aren't the only three. So that when their memory starts to fail, when they started to doubt God's goodness or his provision, when they were tempted to sin, to go their own way, to follow other gods, that instead they could look at the stones and they could remember the God who delivered them, the God who followed through on a promise, the God who did a miracle in the past, so that they could remember. And the story could live in their minds and in the minds of their children and the minds of their children's children. So they could turn and see the stones, and the stones would remind them about the God that they serve. So this morning, I want to follow in their footsteps and create a reminder for us here today. So I've asked a couple guys to pass out some stones and some Sharpies. So they're going to go around, grab a stone and a Sharpie and hold on to it. If you're watching online, maybe you can pause this video and go and find a stone, or since the ground is covered in snow, at least right now, maybe you're going to have to settle for a pen and a Sharpie, or a pen and a Post-it note. I don't know, but here's what I want us to do. As these stones are getting passed around, maybe online as you're going to find something to write on, here's what I want to do. I want you to think of a time when God showed up. A time when he was faithful and good, where he provided, where he delivered, where he rescued, where maybe even he rebuked you and you needed it. But a time when God showed up. Then, in just a minute, we're going to have some time to reflect and some time to do this. I want you to use the Sharpie and mark the stone to commemorate that work of God. Maybe it's a word, maybe it's a date that this happened on, maybe it's a place, maybe you're an artist and you're going to draw a little picture on it. Maybe it's a whole sentence. It's up to you. They're kind of small rocks, so a whole sentence might not fit, but I want you to write something on there commemorating, reminding you of the time that God showed up. And then in a minute, I'm just going to give us some time to pause and to reflect and to think, and then I'm going to pray for us, and then I'm going to start to play a song, and as I do so, I invite you to come up and to bring your rock, and we're just going to make a little pile right over there. So I said, throw your rock over there, and someone was like, you mean literally throw it? So I'm going to be very gently set your rock in the pile over there, where I want these stones to serve as a reminder for us. That on the days where it's cold, like today, where you barely made it out of bed, but somehow you made it to church, you can look at the stones and remind ourselves that God's still at work. When we question whether or not God is actually up to something in our lives, we can see the pile and see that God is still doing stuff in the lives in our own lives, in the lives of the people around us. When we reach a season that feels spiritually dry, we can remind ourselves that it wasn't always like this, and it won't always be like this. The stones can serve as a reminder. And I don't know how long we're going to leave these up here. I don't know, maybe a couple months, maybe all year. I don't know yet. We'll see. But I haven't thought that far ahead. But we're going to make our pile. So this is mine. It's impossible to see because Sharpie is very hard to read on a rock. But it says Gathering 2023. So many of you know earlier this month, Chelsea and I were blessed to go down to an event in Orlando, Florida with our denomination. And I'll be honest, I went into that event spiritually depleted. I felt like if I had a spiritual gas tank gauge, it was riding E. I just felt kind of worn out. But I went down there and God showed up at that event in a big way. And I left feeling refreshed and feeling energized and feeling optimistic about the future of Hub City Church and with fresh vision for where I think God is going to be leading us. And I went there with a gauge that was on empty and I left with a gauge that was on full. And so that's what I want to hold on to and what I want to remember. The time that God showed up down in Orlando, Florida at the gathering. So I want you to take a minute, think of a time, reflect, start a conversation with God about a time. Maybe it's over the last month, maybe it's over the last year. I don't know when it is for you, but write down a time when God showed up. And then I'll pray, and then as I start playing some music, then I'd invite you to come up and to set your rock over there. So let's spend some time just starting that conversation with God, writing on the rock when you feel led to do so.